that the early conservatives were talking about. And this is what's come back to us. Now, we have to give the devil his due. I mean, the important thing to understand here, and the area and the realm of this that most concerns me about many of my peers in progressive talk radio and progressive writing, is that they tend to either demonize or turn into cartoon characters the conservatives who have brought this about. They'll characterize them, particularly inside the group, as oh, those evil people, or oh, those greedy SOBs, or whatever. The reality is, by and large, these people believe themselves to be patriots. They're proud to be Americans. They love this country, and they are doing what they think is the best thing for this country. We're talking about a fundamental difference in worldviews here. We're not talking about good people versus evil people. And as long as we dismiss them by cartooning them or vilifying them, frankly, we won't be able to have the kind of conversation that I think is really necessary for us to have in this country to bring back the middle class, to rescue the middle class from the edge of extinction. So I just want to make that note. Now, the fundamental difference in the worldview between the conservatives and today's small d Democrats and many of the big D Democrats, but let's say liberals and progressives. George Washington, by the way, proudly called himself a liberal, our first liberal president. The primary difference is one of an understanding of how things should be organized. The early conservatives, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, many of the early conservatives were of the opinion that, number one, humans, people, are fundamentally evil and flawed. The Thomas Hobbes worldview. And that only with what Hobbes referred to as the iron fist of government can people live a safe and secure life, because people have to be restrained. The natural impulse of people is to do bad, evil, destructive, damaging things. And that's why you need classes and orders, and that's why it's good that people know their place, and that's why it's good that there not be a lot of social mobility, and that society be relatively stable. The other side of that argument was the Jeffersonian side, who argued that, no, in fact, democracy is the natural state of humans, even though for 7,000 years we haven't had that. I mean, Jefferson pointed out, he talked about the three historic tyrannies, the three forms of government that had always existed before the United States, before they hatched this scheme to come up with a country here. And those were, number one, warlord kings, who ruled by threats of violence. Number two, theocrats, people who ruled by saying, God authorized me to. And number three, rule by the rich, which back in those days was called feudalism. In all cases, in all three of those cases, the rights accrued to those at the top, and privileges dribbled down to those in the bottom. Well, what the founders did that was truly revolutionary in this country was they said, we're going to flip that upside down. And it was the folks like Jefferson and Washington, the liberals, who were leading this thing, who said, this is how it should be. The rights, and Madison in particular, the rights should be with the people. And if any among the people decide that they're going to create an institution, whether that institution is a church, whether that institution is a corporation, whether that institution is a government, even the government of the United States, that institution will not have rights. It will only have privileges, and those privileges will be limited by we the people, the first three words of the Constitution. We the people of the United States of America. And, this is a really radical idea. And in fact, you see this in the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson talks about nature's God. I mean, he was convinced that he saw democracy everywhere. He saw democracy in nature. And you got John Adams saying, no. We'll have a democracy here, but we're going to have to carefully control people. We can't let the rabble have too much power because they'll screw it all up. And Jefferson was, no, it's going to be self-correcting. Yes, they'll screw some things up, but they'll immediately figure out that they screwed it up and they'll undo it. The more people have a say, the larger number of people who have a say, and the more vocal their say is, the more likely it is that the system will eventually and quickly become homeostatic, become balanced. This was Jefferson's view of democracy. Adams' view of democracy, the conservative view of democracy, was, well, let's let people think that they have a say in things, enough to keep them quiet. But really, those of us who know how to run things will run things, and we'll do that. And that's why, in the negotiations, we didn't directly elect the Senate, for example, until 1913. Well, it's interesting. This view of humans as intrinsically evil, which is the core of the conservative worldview, has prevailed for thousands of years. And even Darwin bought into it to a large extent, although he really struggled with it. In my book, What Would Jefferson Do?, I quote some extensively from Darwin. I went back and I read The Descent of Man, which is where Darwin really struggled with this, and his book about where he's looking at Aboriginal people. And how is it that these indigenous people, these savages, can live happily and in peace? I mean, this is, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had been writing about this in the 1600s, and Darwin was still scratching his head about this in the early 1800s. And how could it be? But then in nature he saw alpha animals, the alpha wolf, the she-wolf who would lead the pack apparently, the alpha males who would fight, and it just seemed like what they were seeing was kings and kingdoms, or queens and kingdoms, depending on the species. And therefore it must be that nature is organized hierarchically, that nature is organized in a way that's essentially dominant and submissive, with a small dominant group and a very large submissive underclass. It must be that that's the way nature is, so that must be the way humans should be. And that has invigorated the conservative worldview for, quite some time, and validated it. Well, it's interesting, as I was writing What Would Jefferson Do?, the book that I wrote before this current one, Screwed, the Undeclared War Against the Middle Class, by coincidence, I was reading, I'm a science junkie reader, I subscribe to Nature and Science, I'm a AAAS member, and there was an article in Nature about these two scientists at the University of either Sussex or Essex, I mixed the cities up, in the UK, who had asked the question, is nature really democratic or not? I mean, could it be that nature is more democratic than we think? Could it be that Thomas Jefferson was right when he suggested that democracy is found all across nature? And he so believed that, by the way, that in the Declaration of Independence, or the reference to God in there, it's preceded by the word nature's God. And that was a big deal. I mean, John Adams was like, this should be the Christian God. No. This is nature's God. In other words, the entire natural order Jefferson was seeing as being recreated in democracy. So Conrad and Roper did this study, and then there was another follow-up study that was done. The follow-up study was done with red deer near the university. And they put cameras in the trees, or however they did it. They were just following this large herd of deer. And there were alpha males in the herd, as deer are wont to have. And they figured that the way it would work was, see, the deer have to engage in decision-making. At a certain point, they have to say, okay, time to go to the watering hole. But there's 3 watering holes here. How do we know which one to go to? And how do we know when to go as a herd? Now, you have to travel as a herd because they're prey animals rather than predator animals. And these are not small decisions. And if they go too soon, some of the animals won't get enough nutrients. If they go too late, some of the animals may get dehydrated. So there's got to be a way of figuring out when to go. And which of the water holes do we go to? There may be a predator near one today, or maybe that one is muddy today and it wasn't yesterday, or maybe the water, whatever. How do they make these decisions? Well, the assumption was that the alpha male would say, okay, time to go, guys, let's go, and off they would all go to the water hole. Turns out, what they found was that the animals would be just randomly grazing and pointing in different directions, just going munch, 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 munch. And as it kind of came up on the time when the animals would typically go off to the water hole, different animals, just randomly throughout the group, would start pointing their noses, would just start grazing but facing the direction of one of the 3 watering holes. And when the 51st percent, if it was a herd of 100, when the 51st animal started pointing to one of the watering holes, within a minute or two, the entire herd just formed around that group and boom, off they went. Or not even around that group, because it would have been randomly distributed throughout the herd. And off they went. And very often the alpha male is in the back going, where'd everybody go? What happened? Which then, leads to the question, well, why the alpha male? Well, that gets back to Darwin. That's about, the Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene. It's about passing along the strongest DNA. And that makes evolutionary sense. But having leadership, that doesn't make evolutionary sense. It turns out that democracy is the way of nature. So Conrad and Roper published this in Nature, and I called up, I believe it was Tim Conrad that I interviewed,